It started with a text message that didn't sound like her. A pregnant 23-year-old woman vanished into the night after leaving her apartment with the man who claimed to love her. Hours later, her mother stared at her phone, reading the message over and over again. Something felt cold, forced, wrong. The words were simple, but a mother knows her child. In a city as massive and unforgiving as Houston, people disappear every day, but this case would become something far darker than a missing person investigation. Because behind the smiling photos and public affection was a relationship hiding fear, violence, and secrets nobody fully understood until it was too late. Friends would later describe her as soft-spoken, loving, and excited about becoming a mother. She was preparing for a future she believed was finally taking shape. But investigators would soon uncover signs that the life she showed the world was not the life she was actually living. And at the center of it all stood one man, Kevin Faux, the boyfriend who was supposedly the last person to see her alive. At first, his story seemed calm, almost too calm. He claimed everything was normal. He said they had been together, said she was fine, said there was nothing unusual about that night. But detectives quickly noticed cracks in the timeline. Then came the FaceTime call, a disturbing conversation that would completely change the direction of the investigation. Because while Ashanti's family was desperately searching for answers, investigators began discovering evidence of something hidden beneath the surface. Allegations of domestic violence, emotional control, fear, and moments that now looked less like arguments and more like warnings. Every hour that passed raised another terrifying possibility. Was Ashanti trying to escape something? And if she was, did someone stop her before she had the chance? As investigators retraced her final movements through apartment complexes, phone records, and surveillance footage, one haunting detail kept resurfacing again and again: the text message sent to her mother after she disappeared. The message that didn't sound like Ashanti. The message that would later become one of the most chilling pieces of this entire case. Because by the time investigators realized what may have really happened that night, Ashanti Allen was already gone. The next morning, Ashanti's mother barely slept. That strange text message kept replaying in her mind like a warning she could not ignore. The wording felt distant, cold, almost mechanical. It lacked the warmth her daughter normally carried in every conversation. Even when Ashanti was upset, even when she was stressed, she always sounded like herself. But this message was different. And deep down, her mother already feared the truth. By sunrise, repeated calls to Ashanti's phone were going straight to voicemail. Friends hadn't heard from her either. Her social media accounts had suddenly gone silent. For some people, disappearing for a few hours might not seem unusual, but everyone close to Ashanti understood one thing immediately: she would never disappear willingly, especially not while pregnant. As panic spread through the family, attention quickly turned toward the last known person who had seen her alive, Kevin Faux. At first, Kevin appeared cooperative, calm, relaxed even. Too relaxed. When relatives contacted him asking where Ashanti was, his answers seemed vague and inconsistent. He allegedly claimed she needed space, said she was emotional recently, said she left on her own after an argument. But the more he spoke, the less his story made sense. Family members immediately noticed something disturbing. Kevin never sounded worried, not once. There was no urgency in his voice, no panic, no desperation to help find the pregnant woman carrying his child. Instead, relatives described him as detached, almost rehearsed. That alone raised alarms. But investigators had not yet seen the full picture. As detectives in Houston began digging into Ashanti's final hours, they uncovered a relationship far more volatile than outsiders realized. Behind the photos, behind the smiling videos, behind the image of a young couple preparing for parenthood, there were signs of something darker. arguments, control, fear. According to people close to Ashanti, tension between the couple had reportedly escalated in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Some described heated confrontations. Others claimed Ashanti had become withdrawn and emotionally exhausted. A few even said she seemed afraid to speak openly while Kevin was around. And then detectives learned about the FaceTime call. It happened only hours before Ashanti vanished. One of Ashanti's close contacts later described receiving a FaceTime call that immediately felt disturbing. Ashanti reportedly appeared emotional and uncomfortable. Kevin was allegedly nearby during parts of the conversation, creating a tense atmosphere that left the caller unsettled long after the call ended. At the time, nobody knew they were witnessing what could be one of the final glimpses of Ashanti alive. Now, investigators were beginning to see the timeline differently. The case quickly intensified when detectives obtained phone records and surveillance footage connected to the couple's movements that night. Security cameras reportedly captured portions of their activity around the apartment complex, helping investigators narrow down the critical hours before Ashanti disappeared. But what happened inside that apartment remained unclear, and Kevin's statements continued to shift. In one version of events, he implied Ashanti left voluntarily. In another, timelines reportedly changed. Small details moved around. Certain moments became difficult for him to explain clearly. Detectives are trained to notice behavioral inconsistencies, especially during missing persons investigations. And according to reports surrounding the case, investigators began focusing heavily on contradictions in Kevin's account. Meanwhile, Ashanti's family was collapsing under the weight of uncertainty. Her mother continued calling hospitals, police departments, and friends, desperately hoping someone had seen her daughter. Every passing hour deepened the fear that something irreversible had happened. Then came another devastating realization. Ashanti left behind personal belongings she normally carried everywhere. For investigators, that mattered. People planning to disappear voluntarily usually take essentials: phones, identification, clothing, necessary items. But the circumstances surrounding Ashanti's disappearance suggested interruption rather than intention. As investigators pieced together her final movements, they reportedly uncovered additional information pointing towards prior domestic disturbances within the relationship. While not every argument becomes deadly, investigators know a dangerous pattern often exists before violence escalates: control, isolation, emotional manipulation, threats. And sometimes pregnancy itself becomes a trigger that intensifies abusive behavior. Statistically, domestic violence cases involving pregnancy carry an especially disturbing risk factor. For many investigators, that possibility immediately transformed this case from a missing persons report into something potentially far more sinister. Then investigators made another troubling discovery: the timeline surrounding the suspicious text message. Digital forensic analysts reportedly examined the communications sent from Ashanti's phone after she vanished. Families often notice emotional inconsistencies instinctively, but investigators analyze something even deeper: typing patterns, wording, timing, device movement, and behavioral context. And the more detectives studied the message, the more questions emerged. Was Ashanti truly the one who sent it? Or had somebody else used her phone to create the illusion she was still alive? That possibility sent shockwaves through her family. Because if somebody else had sent that message, it meant there was likely an effort to delay concern and buy time. For investigators, that changes everything. Now, detectives weren't just looking for a missing woman. They were potentially looking at staging, cover-up behavior, manipulation after the fact. And at the center of every critical timeline event stood Kevin Faux. As police pressure intensified, so did public attention surrounding the case. Friends began posting Ashanti's photos online, begging for information. Community members shared missing person flyers across social media. Volunteers searched neighborhoods hoping for any clue that could lead investigators to her. But beneath the growing public campaign was a terrifying reality investigators already understood.
In many domestic violence cases, the most dangerous moment occurs when a victim begins emotionally pulling away from the relationship. And some people close to Ashanti reportedly believe she may have been reaching that point. Detectives continued reconstructing the final known hours minute by minute. Every phone ping, every surveillance camera, every witness statement, every digital trace mattered now. Because somewhere hidden inside that timeline was the truth. What really happened after Ashanti left that apartment with Kevin? Why did the text message feel so unnatural? What caused the fear witnesses reportedly sensed during that final FaceTime call? And perhaps the most horrifying question of all, if warning signs existed before she disappeared, why didn't anyone realize how dangerous the situation may have already become? By the end of that first week, investigators were no longer treating this case as a simple disappearance. Something much darker was beginning to emerge. And soon, investigators would uncover evidence that would completely change the direction of the investigation forever.
By the second week of the investigation, the atmosphere surrounding the case had changed completely. What began as a desperate search for a missing pregnant woman was now turning into something far more disturbing. Detectives were no longer asking whether something bad had happened to Ashanti Allen. They were trying to determine exactly when it happened. Inside police headquarters in Houston, investigators worked through stacks of phone records, surveillance footage, and interview transcripts. Every detail surrounding Ashanti's final hours was being dissected frame by frame. Detectives knew that in cases involving intimate partners, the truth often hides inside tiny inconsistencies: a missing minute, a changed statement, a movement that doesn't fit the timeline. And Kevin Faux's timeline was beginning to collapse. According to investigators, portions of his account no longer aligned with digital evidence. Certain times he provided reportedly conflicted with surveillance footage and phone activity recovered during the investigation. The contradictions may have seemed small individually, but together they painted a deeply concerning picture. Then detectives reportedly uncovered evidence suggesting Kevin had been moving through areas of the city during hours that remained unaccounted for. That discovery immediately intensified suspicion. Why would the boyfriend of a missing pregnant woman fail to clearly explain his movements during the critical window of her disappearance? For Ashanti's family, every new development felt like another punch to the chest. Her mother continued appearing in interviews, emotionally pleading for answers while trying to hold herself together in front of cameras. But behind closed doors, relatives were already preparing themselves for the possibility they feared most. Some relatives reportedly began revisiting old conversations they once dismissed as relationship problems. Now those moments sounded different: a controlling comment, an aggressive argument, a frightened expression quickly hidden when Kevin entered the room. One relative later described feeling haunted by the realization that Ashanti may have been suffering silently for far longer than anyone realized. And then investigators discovered another disturbing layer to the relationship. According to reports surrounding the case, there had allegedly been previous incidents involving conflict between the couple that never fully addressed publicly. Detectives examining the relationship dynamics reportedly became increasingly concerned about patterns commonly associated with coercive control and escalating domestic violence. Experts who study these cases often describe a chilling progression. First comes emotional isolation, then intimidation, then manipulation, and finally, violence severe enough to permanently silence the victim. Now investigators feared Ashanti may have been trapped inside that exact cycle. As public attention grew, social media exploded with theories and speculation. Thousands followed every update, analyzing Kevin's behavior during interviews and public appearances. Many viewers noticed something unsettling. His demeanor rarely seemed emotional. In fact, some described him as strangely disconnected from the gravity of the situation. Body language experts and true crime followers flooded comment sections, pointing out moments they believed reflected deception or emotional detachment. While online speculation alone proves nothing, investigators were already focused on far more concrete evidence. And one piece of evidence continued haunting investigators more than any other: Ashanti's phone. Digital forensic teams reportedly worked extensively to reconstruct the device's final activity.
They examined message timestamps, app usage, location data, and movement patterns connected to the phone after Ashanti disappeared. What they found raised even more questions. Investigators reportedly believed portions of the phone's activity after her disappearance appeared inconsistent with normal behavior patterns. Certain actions taken on the device allegedly seemed more focused on creating appearances than actual communication. In other words, detectives suspected somebody may have been using Ashanti's phone strategically, not emotionally. Strategically. That distinction terrified her family, because if investigators were right, it suggested planning, and planning introduces intent. Meanwhile, detectives returned repeatedly to the apartment complex where Ashanti was last seen. Residents were interviewed again and again. Surveillance footage was re-examined. Vehicle movements were tracked. Detectives searched for anything overlooked during the chaotic first days of the investigation. Then came another breakthrough. Investigators reportedly identified critical gaps in the surveillance timeline, moments where cameras either failed to capture necessary angles or footage was unavailable. While this complicated the investigation, detectives also believed certain movements around the complex appeared deliberate, almost cautious, as if someone understood where cameras were located. That possibility only deepened suspicions surrounding Kevin. But despite mounting suspicions, investigators still faced one major obstacle. They needed evidence strong enough to move beyond suspicion. And then the case took an even darker turn. During interviews with individuals connected to Ashanti's life, detectives reportedly learned that she may have been considering major personal changes shortly before disappearing. Some sources suggested she had been emotionally overwhelmed and increasingly unhappy inside the relationship. For investigators familiar with domestic homicide cases, that detail stood out immediately. Because statistically, one of the most dangerous periods in an abusive relationship occurs when the victim begins emotionally or physically distancing themselves from the abuser. Sometimes the loss of control triggers panic, sometimes rage, and sometimes irreversible violence. As detectives pursued that possibility, pressure around Kevin intensified dramatically. Every new inconsistency fueled public suspicion. Reporters followed developments obsessively. Community members demanded answers. But investigators remained careful. They knew public opinion and courtroom evidence are not the same thing. Behind the scenes, detectives focused on building a timeline prosecutors could eventually present piece by piece. And slowly the timeline became more terrifying. The FaceTime call, the suspicious text, the inconsistent statements, the unexplained movements, the hidden relationship problems, the pregnancy. Separately, each detail raised concern. Together, they began forming a pattern investigators could no longer ignore. Then came the moment that shattered Ashanti's family completely. Authorities reportedly informed relatives that evidence uncovered during the investigation suggested the case may no longer be treated solely as a missing persons case. The emotional impact was devastating. For days, family members had clung to hope that Ashanti was alive somewhere, frightened perhaps, but still reachable. That fragile hope now began slipping away, and investigators still had one horrifying question left unanswered. Where was Ashanti? Search efforts intensified across multiple areas connected to the investigation. Detectives coordinated with specialized teams, following every lead no matter how small. Certain locations reportedly became areas of particular interest as investigators attempted to determine if evidence had been concealed or moved. The city watched anxiously as rumors spread faster than confirmed facts. Then, one night, investigators made a discovery that would alter the entire case forever. Because what detectives found suggested this disappearance may have been far more violent and far more calculated than anyone originally imagined.
The discovery sent shockwaves through Houston. For days, investigators had followed fragments of a story that refused to fit together cleanly. A missing pregnant woman, a suspicious text message, a boyfriend whose timeline kept changing, a disturbing FaceTime call that witnesses could not forget. Now detectives believed they were finally approaching the truth, and the truth was terrifying. According to reports surrounding the investigation, authorities uncovered evidence that dramatically shifted the case from a missing persons search into a potential homicide investigation. Details that had once seemed uncertain suddenly carried horrifying new meaning. The tension inside the investigation intensified immediately. Detectives reportedly began focusing heavily on Kevin Faux's behavior in the hours after Ashanti disappeared. Not just what he said, but what he did. Investigators know that actions after a crime often reveal more than words ever can. People can rehearse statements, they can lie during interviews, but behavior under pressure leaves patterns, and detectives believed Kevin's patterns were becoming impossible to ignore. Phone records, movement data, and witness accounts reportedly suggested a timeline filled with suspicious gaps. Certain periods remained unexplained, certain actions appeared inconsistent with someone desperately searching for a missing loved one. Instead of urgency, investigators allegedly saw controlled behavior, measured behavior, behavior that raised a deeply disturbing possibility. What if Kevin already knew Ashanti was never coming back? That question hung over the investigation like a storm cloud. As authorities tightened their focus, Ashanti's family was forced to confront a reality too painful to fully process. The young woman they loved, the woman preparing to become a mother, may have spent her final days trapped inside fear nobody recognized in time. Family members reportedly began sharing heartbreaking memories with investigators. Small moments that once seemed ordinary now felt loaded with hidden meaning. Times Ashanti appeared emotionally drained, moments she suddenly went quiet during conversations, subtle changes in her personality that people around her had noticed but never fully understood. One relative later described the realization as watching puzzle pieces turn into a nightmare, and investigators were seeing the same thing. The deeper detectives dug into the relationship between Ashanti and Kevin, the darker the picture became. Reports suggested investigators were examining signs of emotional instability, conflict, and possible controlling behavior leading up to the disappearance. Then came another major development. Investigators reportedly uncovered evidence connected to Kevin's movements after Ashanti was last seen alive. Sources close to the case claimed authorities began analyzing specific locations connected to those movements, searching for physical evidence that could explain what truly happened during the missing hours in the timeline. At this point, public attention surrounding the case exploded. Social media users followed every update obsessively. News coverage intensified. True crime communities dissected every known detail, replaying interview footage and analyzing body language frame by frame. Many people became fixated on one chilling aspect of the case: the complete emotional disconnect Kevin appeared to show publicly. While Ashanti's family looked devastated, exhausted, and terrified, Kevin's demeanor reportedly continued raising concern among viewers and investigators alike. Some described him as unusually detached. Others believed he appeared more focused on maintaining the control of the narrative than helping locate Ashanti. Still, detectives needed evidence. Real evidence. Not speculation, not internet theories. Evidence strong enough to expose exactly what happened behind closed doors. Then, investigators reportedly uncovered something even more disturbing. Information suggesting that the violence in the relationship may have escalated before Ashanti disappeared. If true, it meant warning signs had existed long before the public ever knew her name. Experts in domestic violence cases often describe abuse as a slow progression rather than a single explosive event. Victims frequently hide their suffering out of fear, emotional dependency, shame, or hope that the abuser will eventually change. Outsiders may only see occasional arguments without understanding the dangerous reality underneath. By the time visible warning signs appear, the situation is often already severe. Detectives now feared Ashanti had been living inside that dangerous reality for months. And tragically, pregnancy can sometimes intensify abusive dynamics rather than calm them. Investigators understood this well. Statistics show pregnant women facing domestic abuse are at significantly higher risk of severe violence. That knowledge added another horrifying layer to the case. Because Ashanti wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was carrying a child. As pressure mounted, authorities reportedly intensified questioning around inconsistencies connected to Kevin's account of the night Ashanti vanished. Detectives revisited timelines repeatedly, comparing statements against digital evidence and witness observations. And slowly, investigators believed they were identifying moments where the truth may have slipped through the cracks. Then came the discovery that emotionally shattered the family.
Authorities reportedly located evidence indicating Ashanti may never have left the situation alive. The realization was devastating. Family members who had spent days praying for rescue were suddenly confronting the possibility of permanent loss. Hope was being replaced by horror. And yet one painful question continued tormenting everyone connected to the case. Why? Why would a young pregnant woman disappear without warning? Why did the suspicious text message seem designed to delay concern? Why did Kevin's story reportedly continue changing under scrutiny? And perhaps the darkest question of all, what exactly happened during those final unseen hours no camera captured? As detectives closed in, investigators reportedly began preparing for the possibility of criminal charges. Search operations intensified around areas tied to the evolving timeline. Specialized teams continued examining evidence, knowing one overlooked detail could determine whether justice would ever be possible. Meanwhile, Ashanti's story was no longer just a local case. Women across the country began seeing themselves inside her story. The hidden fear, the emotional control, the arguments concealed behind closed doors, the warning signs dismissed as relationship problems. For many viewers following the investigation, the case became more than a mystery. It became a terrifying reminder of how quickly domestic violence can escalate into irreversible tragedy. And investigators knew something the public did not yet fully understand. This case was approaching a turning point, because authorities were reportedly closer than ever to uncovering what happened to Ashanti Allen. And once that final truth emerged, the case against Kevin Faux would become impossible to ignore.